John features John Higgins and Megan, because a little while ago, a few years, John, Megan, Michael and I worked together on the very last program that I was involved in at Ashridge Business School, where I first met Megan. Megan, I can't remember when that was, but it was many years ago.
It was.
Yeah. So Megan and John have done this lot of work together over the years, but this particular piece on employee activism feels extremely relevant in so many ways. I'm just delighted that you've agreed to come along this morning. And I think the best thing I can do is to simply let you speak. You're going to speak for about 40 minutes, I think, and then plenty of time for discussion and questions. So, Megan, John, we're in your hands. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Hello, everybody. Lovely to have you join us here today on a topic that is very dear to our hearts. As Chris mentioned, we're going to speak a little bit about some of the key findings in our research, about the kind of foundation of the Speaking Truth to Power work as well, on which this sits. And then we really want to open it up and have some discussion, because this is a topic that is ripe for discussion and is full of controversy, as you'll discover. So, as we've mentioned already in the introduction, John and I have been exploring the topic of speaking truth to power for about 7 years now. That essentially, and it's important just to lay the framing, because this work on politics sits underneath this. Speaking truth to power is about what gets said and what doesn't, and who gets heard and who doesn't, in particular contexts. And one thing that really influences what gets said and who gets heard is how we construct relative power, status, and authority. So that's been a really big theme in our work. You know, how in various different situations do we title and label one another in a way that helps people to voice, or in a way that silences people. And one way we've looked at this body of work, which really links to the mindfulness aspect of this, is through conversational habits. So you and I and our teams, and then our organizations, have habits around what gets said, what doesn't get talked about, what's okay to talk about, what's not okay to talk about. And we absolutely have habits around whose voice do we tend to listen to, whose voice gets disappeared. And those habits, and as we'll come on to, of course, how mindful we are of those habits, and how mindful we are of how we disrupt those habits when we need to, they have consequences. They have huge consequences for us, our teams and our organizations. And of course, much of our work has been situated within the organizational context. And one of the consequences, of course, has been over the past few years, we've seen organization after organization on the front page of the newspaper, very often for the wrong reasons, because somebody has spoken up finally and wasn't able to before, or there's been silencing that's been occurring. As John mentioned, we started this whole thing years ago with the VW scandal. And underneath this Speaking Truth to Power project over the last few years, we've really begun, obviously, to be interested quite specifically in employee activism. And I'll come on to a definition there. And underneath that particular project on our employee activism is the real question at the heart, the kind of provocative question for this webinar, which is, you know, those organizations banning political conversations at work, which has been a feature in quite a few stories that we've had over the last few months. So we've published widely on this topic, as you'll see here, and we've also published widely on the connections between Speaking Truth to Power and mindfulness as well. But I want to just say a few words. I'll say a few words around activism generally and a couple of our key research findings. And then we're going to dive in to specifically some of the points that we made in the Harvard Business Review article, which we just published, which is called Don't Ban Politics at Work. So my first question very directly to you that I want you to think about right now is, what words come to mind when you think of activism and activists? So just pause a second and notice any images, any words, experiences, emotions that you associate quickly with activism and activists. John and I have asked thousands and thousands of people that question already. Here's an example of a word cloud that came up with a particular group of people that we researched with. And essentially, I probably don't need to tell you, activism is a very loaded term. And actually, we need to recognize what we bring into this discussion right at the start. Because we found that activism is in the eye of the beholder, as we put it. When I spoke to Ruchika Tulsian, who wrote The Diversity Advantage, she memorably said, you know, what appears to be rebellion to one person is another person's basic human rights and a matter of kind of survival in the organizational setting. Now, when you ask people about activism, we had people that connected with sort of emotions. It had connections of commitment, of change, of courage, tenacity, and it's got connections with being arrogant, disruptive, as I mentioned, rebellious, attention-seeking, irrelevant. So just to give you an example of how this matters, you know, we are writing at the moment about an individual in an organization who raised the topic of climate change and carbon footprint in the organization on the organization's Slack communication platform. And at the board level, we'd have some members of the board looking at this guy thinking, disruptive, troublemaker, what's he up to? How do we basically silence him? Black mark against that person. And then you've got members of the board that also look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. Actually, you know, I think maybe we should engage with this. This is, you know, a bit uncomfortable, but let's face it, this conversation needs to be had. I think this person is a change maker. I think this person is challenging us. This person needs to be recognized and taken care of. So how do you come into this conversation on activism and activists? How do you come into the conversation on whether political conversation should be engaged with, encouraged, suppressed in organizational settings? And we really do need to be mindful of our assumptions as we come in on this. So we offer one definition, if you like, of employee activism, but in the recognition, obviously, that there is no right definition here. But what we've been exploring are voices of difference that challenge the established status quo around who gets heard and what should be included in the formal organizational agenda. And so these voices inside organizations, very often they're talking about things like climate change, gender, racial equality, modern slavery, all sorts of issues that traditionally have been relegated to, that's the kind of stuff that you talk about outside work, and inside work you talk about the work bit, you talk about the targets. Well, that's changing. That's seriously changing. And with it, of course, is a huge disruption in our understanding of power and who gets to make the decisions inside organizational systems. Now, in terms of how we respond and how we've seen organizations respond to employee activism and indeed political conversations, we've developed what we call a kind of taxonomy of responses. And we've written about this in a few places so far. So you can think of organizational responses and individual manager responses in terms of these 6 categories. Again, not supposed to be exhaustive, and obviously they overlap. But perhaps you can draw your mind to kind of what's your response to activism in the workplace? What have you seen the response of others be? At one end of the spectrum, we've got what we call non-existent. So this really, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a chief executive probably about 2 months ago about his business. And in the course of the conversation, I raised employee activism. And he looked utterly baffled. It's just, just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've not even engaged with, I don't even know why you're bringing this up. And that's kind of non-existent. It's not on the agenda. It hasn't been discussed. We're just carrying on. It's not that we're suppressing it or encouraging it. It's just not even there. Okay. Now, I think that's an increasingly difficult response to hold, but it is there. And then we've got a response which we call suppression. And as it sounds, this is when voices are silenced, either very overtly. For example, in our HBR article, we talked about Coinbase and Basecamp as examples in the US of chief executives very clearly saying, you will not talk about this subject in this particular context. So suppression often leads to people being fearful of the consequences of speaking up on topics. And as we might say in a little while, of course, suppression very rarely silences, actually. It just drives it in underground and into different places. Facadism, a lot been talked about facadism. So this is the response when organizational leaders or managers say all the right things, and they might proclaim about the importance of a particular issue, but there is no action that backs up anything that they're saying. So it's a facade. And in the past, maybe employees might have sort of put up with that with a roll of the eyes. And what we're seeing now is that employees will go, no, wait a second. On September the 5th last year, you said this, and it's not happened. Why not? Okay. So leaders and managers being sort of called to account much more publicly. Brewdog is another recent example of a Scottish firm that you might have seen in the news, where employees and ex-employees very publicly said, you say all this stuff about our business and particularly our environmental credentials, but we don't see what's happening there. Then we've got a category called defensive engagement. And this is when organizations and leaders do what they feel they absolutely have to, kind of from a legal perspective, but don't do any more. So it's a kind of attitude of, oh gosh, if we really have to. And if it's to do with gender equality, for example, it's like, okay, how many do we have to have? It's that sort of attitude. Dialogic engagement shows a shift between what we might call reactive response and proactive response. So dialogic engagement involves a very different sort of mindset. It involves moving towards what we don't understand and don't know. So this is a big shift for leaders and managers, and it's reaching out with curiosity, wishing to learn. And very importantly, it's also reaching out with a desire to share decision-making. What shall we do about this issue? What issues shall we choose to make a stand on? That's a big, big difference. And then finally, you've got some organizations, the Patagonias, the Ben and Jerry's of this world, that we might say actually stimulate activism. You know, they are known as activist organizations. They recruit activists. They reward and recognize activists. They pay the bail of activists that have ended up in jail over protests. Okay, so we're using this kind of taxonomy with organizations and teams and indeed individuals to just allow the teams to become more mindful of what is our reaction, what's our response, what choices do we have, and how do we make those choices? So a couple of things just to say very quickly, and then I'll hand over to John. Fascinating in our research. If you're familiar with our research on speaking truth to power, you'll be familiar with what I'm just about to talk to you about. If you ask senior employees, how is your organization responding to employee activism? They are far more likely to say that that response is dialogic engagement or indeed stimulating activism. They're far more likely to say to us, yeah, you know, our organization's pretty proactive on this. We're having some good conversations. And then you ask junior employees, I'm exaggerating slightly, but your junior employee tends to look at us and roll their eyes and go, no, they're not. They're just doing what they have to. So there's a very different perspective on management response, depending on whether you're asking the managers themselves or junior employees. And part of this is due to what we call, you might have heard us speak about this, the optimism bubble. The more senior you get, the more you are likely to overestimate the degree to which people feel able to speak up. The more you're likely to overestimate your listening skills and your approachability. So you tend to be in a bit of a bubble. And part of that's to do with something that we call advantage blindness, is when you have the titles and labels that convey advantage. We often don't notice it. We don't notice the influence and impact that those labels have on others. And we have the kind of illusion that we're pretty good at all of this stuff, aren't we? And our research has shown fairly resoundingly, no, not really. So leaders can get into a bit of a bubble. So when we start talking about politics in the organization, leaders may well say, actually, yes, we can have political conversations. It's, you know, we're reaching out, we're engaging people, but that won't be the felt and lived experience necessarily of more junior employees. So I'll finish my bit by just putting up this cartoon, which is one that we had in our employee activism report that we published earlier this year, which has on the one side, if you're just listening to this, I'll describe it. On the one side, it says, I'm apolitical. And on the other side, it says, translation, I'm privileged and unaffected, if not benefiting from current politics. This is kind of quite interesting to put up here, because one thing that we've seen organizations do in this activist and political arena is to make the statement that they're apolitical. We're neutral. We can step out of this. We're just focused on the work. You know, it's not for us, you know, we'll stay on the fence. And as John will go on to explore more with you, actually, there is no such thing as being apolitical. Our choices not to take a stand are as political as our choices to take a stand. That does not mean, of course, that we make a stand on everything, but it does mean that we have to be mindful of the way we make our choices. And those are the really key decisions, I think, for leaders, is how do we make a choice around what we stand for and engage with? John, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, you just nudge up the next slide. And you were a good reminder that a number of people I know, I think, are doing in the car and things. I'll sort of talk things through a bit more than possibly I normally do. What I'm really struck by that cartoon is the reminder that we live in an age where I've experienced the misapplication of the scientific method, which is where we talk about somebody being able to have a neutral observer position. And again, particularly when working in organizational settings, often the more senior people will think that the problem is with them. They don't need to be engaged in a process of inquiry about how do we get more dialogic, for instance. And the point is, this is a world of participative inquiry, where you can't just do some neutral diagnosis. The simple act of looking at something is in itself creating the findings that you're going to come up with. So what I'm going to talk about now is a framework we've come up with, which allows us, we'd hopefully suggest it might help you unpick, how do you get your head around this extraordinarily slippery subject. So this is not a prescriptive framework. It's a sort of mnemonic that happens to spell the word active, but with an F at the end. So we spent quite a lot of time coming up with that one. And it's the idea of, okay, if you pay attention to these dimensions, if you have conversations about these dimensions, you're going to be able to explore what is our relationship to activism. And in terms of the specific recent HBR article, the relationship to, if we want to do something like ban politics or ban a conversation about a certain area, more widely, there's a lot of contexts we come across. There's the default of a zero tolerance. And I think both of us are very, very uncomfortable with the growth of zero tolerance thinking. So top of the active model starts with an A, and it's to do with authority in the workplace. And Megan's already raised the issue of the dialogic phrase. And broadly, if you are wanting to engage with, how do we contain or engage with difficult subjects, which often we've not had to engage with? Is this something that we see as a collective endeavor? In terms of the Joyce Fletcher work, this is power with. This is where we see ourselves as sharing responsibility. Unfortunately, I'm particularly thinking of my work in the NHS, the knee-jerk reaction and the desire to show action, and we fall back into the old tropes which are meant to have been disappeared but are alive and kicking, the heroic instant action leader, the dreadful language of the strong leader, falls into the power over. For those of you who are familiar and comfortable with the world of transactional analysis, this is the replaying of the critical parent, the parent-child dynamic. And you get into uncomfortable areas where, within a lot of organizational settings, there is a lot of parent-child behaviors. And also when it comes to, we'd like you to be empowered and collective about certain subjects, let's say new ideas, new products, new ways of working. But when it comes to other subjects, then the iron fist of the hierarchy clunks in. So hence, sort of the Coinbase sort of thing. We are not going to talk about politics. We are going to be laser focused on our mission, as if something that otherwise impacts people's lives can be walled off. The second bit of the active model concerns the C, and it's the concern. How much does this matter to people? How much energy actually exists? And Megan talked about this whole idea of you can ban it, but the energy's still there. All that happens is that the energy gets diverted. And the idea is it might not matter to you. As a cisgendered white man, I am completely, well, I would say neutral, but I do not experience the energy that, for instance, is blowing up all over the place around issues to do with gender identification and trans matters. And I notice as I say that, I know that I'm walking into a minefield and become quite nervous about it. And at one level, you're thinking, well, surely in the workplace, we can ignore that sort of issue. But the point is that impacts directly on the provision of toilets, for instance. So it does have a very material impact, and a decision that if you're a senior bloke that looks a bit like me, you wouldn't even consider that this is doesn't come in through the workplace, shut at the doors, absolutely has a real minutiae impact on people's lives. The third dimension, so we've done authority, done concern. The T is the theory of change, which might sound like a somewhat esoteric matter to bring into consideration, but it speaks to an entire world view. And it's one that touches right to the spirit of the age and where we're what we're dealing with at the moment. I think, and I was reading the FT yesterday, and we are at one of those cusp points where, you know, we've lived with 30 to 40 years of Friedman-esque, the idea that particularly in the for-profit sector, an organization broadly can do what it likes. You know, the social rules are that a company in a for-profit sector makes money and any other consideration is secondary. That is the idea from a theory of change point of view, that an organization or an individual is independent or sort of an autarkic island, entire and perfect to themselves. And you'll notice my bias reeking as I sort of talk about this. The other dimension we're saying is, if you take a view that all human beings, all human life is actually interdependent, that there are no fixed boundaries, everything leaks into each other, then you are going to have a very different view. You aren't going to believe that you can wall anything off. And we've discovered the fear that a lot of organizational leaders have is that, well, when are we ever going to get around to doing the work? Because if we're going to be worrying about everything, then Megan got into sort of a rather sort of challenging Twitter thing at one point, where again, it's the idea of, well, if you're going to be a politically active organization, well, you've got to be politically active on every front. And we'd say, well, this is where you get into the matter of choice. This is where you as a collective discuss. We can't, you know, boil the ocean dry, but we're going to have to make choices about where we invest our energy while acknowledging our interdependence. The fourth one, so we've done authority, concern, theory of change. Identity is the I in active. And this is, when we were doing this, particularly the early interviews, what we found is, to what extent is activism part of somebody's personal identity? A lot of people who were sort of much more, you know, for instance, people who grew up in families where you went on demonstrations, where you went on campaigns, particularly when we're thinking internationally, we're thinking about you grew up in cultures where, you know, objecting to the sort of the established authorities was taken for granted. And again, so Megan and I have grown up in the UK, which for all its flaws has a sort of really relatively a sort of liberal democratic thing. And the assumption is that if you really object to what the authorities are up to, you can go out and complain. I would say that if you've grown up within, let's say, China and are living there at the moment, you're going to have a somewhat different view. And in terms of the dimensions that we've sort of drawn the polls on there, is, do you see yourself as a rule maker or a rule taker? And you can see organizations, Ben and Jerry's, for instance, very much at the sort of the rule maker end of things. And the last thing concerns the field, which is really for a particular issue, how much is this a matter of context? Again, so these days, sort of climate change, man-made climate change, carbon footprints is now, you know, on the press the whole time. It is a normal topic of conversation, a normal topic of concern. Go back 10 years ago, it was still viewed as a minority thing. You were viewed as a sort of a, possibly even still use the phrase, a bit of a tree hugger if you were worried about that. It has now become a prominent issue. And what we're seeing is that as people get more used to bringing more of themselves, and they're often invited to bring their whole selves into work, although people often are a bit shocked when they do that, is all sorts of issues are now coming in, which historically have been viewed as off limits from a workplace environment. One of the people we spoke to, it was interesting, was exploring the influence of domestic abuse. So they work in a local council, and they had a number of thousands of employees, and they used to do a lot of outreach work for the citizens of the borough. And again, they know that you know, domestic abuse is a big thing. And then somebody said, yeah, but we know, given how many thousands of people we employ, that we've got probably hundreds of people who are actually living with the consequences of that. And you can't, you know, ignore, you know, somebody cannot, you know, park the consequences of an abusive relationship when they come into the workplace. But it's an interesting challenge as to where does the workplace responsibility begin or end? Okay, what's the next one? So what we're going to do now is, this is we've drawn out the headlines from the HBR piece, which was explicitly titled "Don't Ban Politics," which was a more provocative title than we wanted, because we wanted, you know, if banning politics is the answer, ask a better question. But that doesn't drive your hit rate to quite the same extent. So these are the 4 headline recommendations. And I'd say that, you know, they are deceptively straightforward, and we're going to just dig into each of them in turn shortly. So the building empathy and respect for others, again, you know, a lovely aspiration. But then you start unpicking what looks like a sort of a nice warm statement. Say, okay, let's take the word respect. We have a colleague who was working with a big European multinational, which involves people from all over the world. You know, do you work from a sort of ideological perspective that respect, or a theological perspective that respect is earned or given? And again, very different cultural traditions will invite a very different aspect. And again, we talk about empathy, but often we it collapses. Are we still working with empathy in the service of instrumentalization, for instance? Are we still seeing that this empathy is so that the thing who is the other person will be more conducive to connect to me? Or are we actually really exploring reconfiguring our relationship with someone? Second one is invite different perspectives into the leadership fold. Again, well, of course, who doesn't want to bring difference in right up until the moment that they experience it, and then so often difference disappears. The third one, again, sounds like a lovely, gorgeous phrase: accept mistakes gratefully. This, when we think about how brutally competitive most organizations are, how invested so many of us are in being right, and actually the idea that, you know, even admitting that we can make a mistake. And if we could do this, broadly, what was it? Peter Senge was writing about the learning organization. I can't think how many years ago now, 40 years, 30 years ago. We'd all be in these gorgeous learning organizations, but that ain't the case. The learning organization briefly pops into existence and disappears as fast as it comes. And then the fourth one, and we will unpack these in more detail in a second, is teach people how to disagree. Right, that again, that's a loaded thing. How on earth do you do that? And again, the temptation is to go prescriptive. We're going to give people a training course. We're going to teach them. But actually, and this is the image we'll build on, is God is in the details. How 2 people come together. And most of us have been in long-term relationships. You know how to disagree well and badly with your other half. And if you've got children, you know how to do that as well. Now, Megan, you're going to take over for this one, because I think this is part of your doctoral thesis.
So we'll just spend a couple of minutes on each of these, and then we can open this up, because I think it will raise quite a few questions and hopefully experiences and some examples. So this first one, as John was saying, is build empathy and respect for others, and it is such a standard comment. You can kind of almost throw it away. It's like, yeah, that's really important. Yeah, we have a picture here on the slide of Martin Buber and his work Iron Thou. And yes, I did. This was the philosopher that I studied for my doctoral work. And Martin Buber described 2 ways of relating in the world, to the environment, to other people. And one was I-it, which is a kind of instrumental way of relating to the other, whether that's the environment or whether that's a person. And it's when we relate with a view to what we want out of, what ourselves we want out of that relationship. So it's more self-centered. It's more about kind of getting done what we need to get done. And that's a really important way of relating. And it's a way of relating that we do a lot inside our organizational systems. He also talked about I-thou relating, which is when we, in his words, are able to turn towards the other person. And I think that language is really wonderful, actually. It's that it gives that moment of pause, that moment where we bring our mindful attention towards the other, where we see the other person as a unique individual, and yet at the same time, we understand how we're inextricably linked and intertwined. We understand how, how I show up affects your voice. And what you voice affects what I then say. So it's a very different sort of quality of meeting and relationships. And actually, Martin Buber was not kind of saying everything must be I, thou is the best. But he was saying that a world devoid of I and thou relating is a tragedy. And it's a tragedy in our organizations when we are not seeing one another. We're not turning towards one another. Now, what makes building empathy and respect tricky? Loads of things here. We put a couple on this slide. The wider social context, which has been written about a lot, the polarization that we see across social media, the increasing kind of what seems like mudslinging matches. I believe this, you're wrong. This is right. And the Twitter conciseness of that lack of discussion and an environment which really does emphasize this kind of individualism. So that, of course, affects how we land up in organizational settings with one another. We have internal narratives. We have internal narratives around who we hear, who we need to or should pay attention to, and who we shouldn't. A lot of that's driven by our unconscious bias. And so, the simple statement of build empathy and respect has to first go through the tricky road of, well, hang on, what judgments and assumptions am I already bringing with me around, let's face it, who's worth listening to, who's not worth listening to? We've got to engage in those questions, and that gets in the way, of course, that gets in the way of empathy and respect, as does, John and I discovered fairly early on that we all tend to have a higher regard for our own opinion than the opinion of others. Sometimes 3 times as high an opinion for our own thoughts. So we need to kind of get through that to build empathy and respect. We tend to recruit and promote sameness. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well, in our organizations. So, we're not tending to appreciate or lean in towards learning from difference. We appreciate sameness. We pay attention to sameness. We have organizations, of course, that, and John mentioned a direct quote from Coinbase, I think, or was this Basecamp, or both of them, a laser focus on our organization's target and mission. And we're trying to get people to a kind of common purpose. And in that, we tend to, again, disappear difference. And then there's workplace insecurity. We have workplaces that are rife with anxiety, upheaval, and the very opposite of psychological safety. And when we're in a place of fear and anxiety, we're very often not in a place to lean forward with empathy and respect for others. So it's all kind of linked in, and again links back to the mindfulness work we've done, is how I show up, how I am in myself, how I'm able to notice that and have self-compassion actually, really, really impacts my ability to hear, listen, respect, and appreciate difference. So that's the first one. And then John, I think you're going to say a few words on inviting different perspectives into the leadership fold.
I've increasingly, I used to start off using this particular quote, I think to be deliberately provocative, but these days I say it with all seriousness. I'm going to start with a piece of work that comes from 2 guys, Smith and Berg. And the paper had the snappy title of A Paradoxical Conception of Group Dynamics, which if you want to engage with any group in a workplace is a title that grabs them. But the important thing that paper identified was that within groups, people are often invited in because they are different. You suddenly realize, oh, we need this particular skill. we need this particular personality, we need this, people with this disposition. And then when they are invited in the group, in order not to be ejected, they have to abandon their difference. And it is this thing, in order to come in, you arrive with your difference. In order to stay in the group, you have to abandon your difference. And this is the idea that, you know, the group, the majority, does not have to change its behavior. All the work has to be done by the outsider, the person who is different. It's always them that has to do the work. And the majority are not aware that they are the ones who have to do the work. So let me just spell out shortly some of the bumps in the road that come with inviting these different perspectives into the leadership fold. Again, so somebody new arrives in the group, somebody who's got a different perspective. We've got a new diversity and inclusion officer, and often there is this rush to action. We assume, right, we've got the person in, what do we do? And we don't take the time to actually understand what is this different perspective that is being brought to us. And the point is that news of difference, news of a way of seeing the world, of an ethnic or a gender perspective, which has been, missing for generations. When you are just the same group, your ability to, you don't have to question your assumptions and everything, so you can rush to action. And particularly in a culture where we've stripped out, we've had the cult of efficiency has taken over. We've got this default to busyness. To actually spend a meeting saying, we should really get to understand each other is not a default. Again, the idea of a good meeting is a fast meeting. All that stuff about we'll meet with standing up because then everyone will be uncomfortable and we get to action. But what we've got is a whole load of downstream busyness. And because of that, we're not looking upstream to the headwaters of our thinking, to borrow from the work of David Bone. And if you're part of this not rushing to action is seeking to understand the message and the messenger. And it's the idea that if somebody is coming to you who is promoting an activist agenda, who is coming to you with a particular attention to an issue that has historically not been paid attention to, this is probably part of their personal identity. To say, we want you to park your personal attraction to this, we want you to be objective about this, again, is a nonsense. And often when people who have been outsiders, who have been overlooked, who have been ignored, they are often not used to being heard. They're used to having to be strident, they're in their campaign mode, they're in their activist, waving the banners mode. They're not used to being heard well because they've been too busy trying to kick the door down because the door's so barred to them. And so it's this thing of, until you've given people the opportunity and time to sort of burn through the heat, that they are going, there is your responsibility of, what do I have to do here to make them heard well? As an aside of that, I came across, I think that Capita in the UK have just started recruiting employees as non-executive directors. And they've realized they have to, really support people in order to become non-executive directors and be employees. Because as you can imagine, that's a hugely complicated role. They're often younger and different. One of the things that helps different voices come in is don't insist on a business case from the start. Again, it's the triumph of instrumentalization. I love your difference, love the perspective you're bringing in. Right, what's the business case? And again, something that really matters to me, that's of intrinsic value, you're suddenly immediately trying to turn into cents and dollars. And the idea, there is a case for that within our culture where you do have to make a business case. But if you insist on that from the start, it's a sign that you're not taking it seriously. There is a facadism at work here. And I think for senior leadership teams, when somebody comes in from a different perspective, from a minority, well, sometimes a majority that's been overlooked or excluded, you can feel uncomfortable because you suddenly realize the extent to which the game has been biased in your favor. And it's quite shameful. It's a bit embarrassing to expect. And the other thing is that often senior people like to feel very expert. And so suddenly to stumble into being inexpert again is again shameful. And the last point before just moving on to the next one, Megan, is this is clock time versus heart time. These sort of conversations take time. And with our fixation with, everything's got to be in a bullet point, we've got to move on, we don't realize that the human heart moves slowly. this is the other one. So the picture of those of you who are listening in cars, this is about accepting mistakes gracefully. And we've basically got a picture of, you know, if you want to keep your mouth shut, you'll never put your foot in it. And a picture of a mug with open mouth, insert foot. You know, for Megan and I working in this field, you know, you are constantly putting your foot in it as you find another area of sensitivity that one can stumble through in hobnail boots. So in terms of accepting, the whole point is we are human, all too human. I was doing a podcast last week and I just emphasized that we are built of crooked timber, and we build our organizations as if we were, you know, machine drilled and, you know, perfectly fitted. You know, what would organizations look like if we approached them from the idea that as human beings, we are all flawed and we all have our weirdnesses? They would look so different from everything else. In terms of some of the points, everyone will put their foot in it. The old cliche of Samuel Beckett, the best you can do is fail better. I'm sort of increasingly attached to that as a leadership mantra. The other thing is that, and I will have done this as I've been talking, and Megan will have done it as she's been talking, and as you are talking, you reveal biases and ignorance, because you suddenly show things you don't expect. You have not been brought to your conscious awareness. Third point, I've already touched on the zero tolerance thing. Zero tolerance creates spirals of silence. I was talking in the last couple of days with a chief executive of a pharma company, and he is sort of Bangladeshi background, and he's working with in an area of the world. The rest of his executive team are all white Europeans. And finally, one of the executive team came up with the comment of, you know, because there's this very strong drive on diversity inclusion, and they are so aware of particularly their ethnic biases. This particular white senior executive said, it feels like, you know, I'm being marginalized. And if you come at it from a purist advantage blindness thing, you're saying, well, you know, wake up and smell the coffee. You know, you've been playing with loaded dice the rest of your life. This is what we feel like. But this particular chief executive said, actually, for that guy that right now, this is what their reality is. And the simplest thing would have been to shame him into silence rather than saying, okay, let's explore that. Let's try and understand what it feels like when you've had an easy invitation, when it comes away. And the whole point is finding points of connection. I'm reminded particularly of, you know, we all have common humanity, and I've written here that it's a family, food, and fiascos. There's nothing like sharing, you know, a time when you've got it completely wrong to connect with other people. But one of the people I talked to was, again, trying to raise an organization responding to Black Lives Matter. And he was invited in by, I think it was the group chair, and they were sitting next to each other in the boardroom. And I just remember that while he was chatting, he said that he and this guy were sharing pictures of their family, of their kids. And that is, you know, a lot of people have kids. That's a fantastically leveling experience. Megan, I think you're going to do the next one.
Yes, so final one, and then I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this, and then we will open this up for discussion. So final one is teaching people how to disagree. Again, this is something that we can espouse. This is something that we can say that we are good at doing. Yeah, I'm fine with difference. I'm fine if you think differently to me. But what are people's actual experience, and what do they notice inside, and what do they learn from their leaders in relation to this in organizations? So how can senior people relearn or learn how to be challenged? Again, we have a model of leadership which is still incredibly focused on advocacy over inquiry. Advocacy absolutely has its place, and to take advantage of experience and expertise. But where is the level of inquiry that we see role modeled by our leaders? That's the thing, you know, and just think to the leaders that you're working with, or if you're in an organization, the leaders that you see, how much do you see them inquiring, moving forward with curiosity? And we've got the little conversations first. So our ability to disagree depends on how we empathize and we understand with one another. And that depends on small social conversations, the sharing of photos, as John just mentioned. And what we've noticed actually over the last year and a bit, when people have been working from home, is that their networks have narrowed quite considerably. And whilst there was a conversation at the beginning of the pandemic that was unusual because it reached out and we asked one another how we were, that has kind of tapered off as the pandemic has gone on. So we don't have the basis of little conversations, the social interactions that then enable and hold differences to be dealt with and managed properly. So catching yourself in the moment of, okay, I may think I'm good at role modeling challenge, receiving challenge well, but what actually do I do? What signals am I sending to others? We work quite a lot with action learning sets inside organizations. So when organizations are seeking to change habits in the way that they speak up and listen up, when they're seeking to change habits in terms of allowing and enabling disagreement, the process of action learning sets, which we can say more about in the discussion, if that's something you'd like to know more about, that process of bringing together groups to practice that, actually, to build muscle in that, is a really, really helpful intervention. So we're working with the kind of current reality, change by moving into the adjacent space. So we're not kind of trying to do anything too radical in terms of this disagreement, but just seeking to alter and change habits moment by moment. Again, that links in well to the mindfulness work. And knowing yourself, I'm going to say some more about this in the discussion. So actually everything that we've talked about in terms of altering habits, our own and our relationship habits within organizations, rely on our capacity to spot in the moment what we're doing. Changing habits doesn't happen unless you spot that you're about to do what you've always done. So all of these elements rely on our ability to go, yeah, I'm just about to do what I've always done. And in this moment, I'm going to choose to do something slightly different. And that's how you begin to change habits. So I think we're going to pretty much sum up there. John, we've got the key aspects, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Okay, so I'm just going to read off the summary slide. I won't go on to the next one, Megan. I'll leave it with at the end of this one. So yeah. This is a summary, both pulling on the activism research, and it draws on all our work into speaking truth to power. Activism is about conversational patterns. You can talk about structures, you can talk about all you want, but it is in the coming together of people and how they talk together, who gets heard, who listens, and about what. As we said earlier in here, activism is in the eye of the beholder. You might say that's not activism, but it is to me. This is human rights. This is just an annoyance. Activism is about voices of difference that challenge the status quo. As we said, this is all about power. And again, we like to disappear it. We like to talk about flat organizations. You put three people together and they'll create a pecking order. Just happens. Senior people see more positive response to activism in their organization than junior people. This is the optimism bias. And the more senior you are, the more in touch you're going to believe you are, and the less you are. Hard and a really tough message to, as an outsider, to give to people. And that active framework that we talk to, the authority, concern, theory of change, identity, and field framework, is we offer it as a way of getting to grips with a very slippery topic. So that's that. Michael, I think you're going to MC from here. We've talked for slightly longer than we anticipated.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Megan. That was so illuminating and so useful. I'm particularly struck, as you can imagine, by your reiteration, or at least what I noticed as a kind of reiteration of respond, don't react. And first of all, know that you're reacting, catch yourself reacting, see a reaction as a reaction is how you change it into a response. and you know, the sort of the mindfulness drumbeat that lies underneath all of this, very clear to me. But yes, it would be great to hear from people. And I suggest that one way in which we might be able to do this is people just raise hands if you can. I'm conscious that some people may be in cars or trains or not have access to icons. Chris, you have a...
Michael, yeah. I mean, as I was listening to this, I thought, you know, God, I really respect Megan and John in this work, but I'm wondering, you know, what drives them to do it? I mean, yeah, there are easier ways to earn a living, mate. You know, what? So how come? Why are you doing this?
Is it okay? This is, oh gosh, I always worried that I'm going to sound like the most arrogant prig in the world. I have absolute fixation with denying people their voice. There's something about if somebody is not given the opportunity to be meaningfully heard, it's stripping them of their identity. And I know this is all bound up with good childhood stuff, but you know, to deny someone their voice is to deny someone their life.
Megan?
My fascination is, I mean, it's very similar. My doctoral work was on dialogue inside organizations, but that's far more than what we say. So I'm not just talking about conversation. My obsession is how we show up in workplace settings that enable us to flourish and that enable other people to flourish. Yeah. And I see very few examples where that's happening, and the tragedy of how we squeeze ourselves and others into a tiny little box keeps me awake at night. So that has led me to a place of trying to understand, how do we show up? How do we help our own voice and the voice of others? How do we help ourselves to be who we can be at work, which of course also then enormously impacts the environment and the society we're developing together. So that's my...
Yeah, because I mean, you know, massive respect to you both for doing it. And I've known about your work on this in this area since your doctorate, since the Buber stuff and dialogue. And you know, one of the things that struck me as you were speaking is something that goes back a long way for me. My background is industrial history. And I was thinking about the Tolpuddle martyrs, and I was thinking about Luddites, you know, and the history of industrial societies is the history of people representing their human rights against organizational change or in the face of great economic movements. So in many ways, this isn't new. And I just wonder how much of what we're talking about is woven into the very fabric of industrial society. You know, Buber's talking about seeing humans as humans, but an awful lot of the way we structure society is about privileging capital, and humans are totally in service of capital, and anything that threatens capital is shut down. And what you're doing is advancing a massively radical agenda, and it's, you know, it's sacred and human, but my God, it's difficult.
Yeah, and how it manifests day to day is, you know, our organizations, for example, organizations knocking at the door and saying, we really would like to, you know, engage in this better or change the culture, or we'd like our employees to speak up. You know, that's a classic. We want our employees to speak up. Megan, could you possibly come and do a keynote? You'll have 30 minutes. And what you're referring to, Chris, which I know Michael will appreciate as well, is, you know, we are we are bound within systems
Mm.
that create conditions through which we come to see one another instrumentally. You know, we have so many cues in our context that point us towards that kind of the habits that are very ingrained. And so when we start to talk about how do we change how we show up with one another in systems, that's massive, you know. And before we start to think, well, it's so massive, it's impossible, one way in is to examine, well, what are some of our mundane habits, and how this is the importance of mindfulness. How can we develop a sustained awareness of how we habitually perpetuate these sorts of relationships, or we begin to disrupt them? And I think that's really fascinating. I see a couple of other hands.
Yeah, but
thank you very much, John.
I've been reading in the chat Mo Ali's comment. So those of you who haven't seen it, my reception. What makes a fair fight with the power dynamic when the powerful perpetually feel it's fair and the powerless often perceive it as unfair? I just linking back to Chris's thing about, you know, the history of power, and the whole notion that no group, I believe, in history has ever voluntarily given up power and status. And I'm just sort of every so often now quote the Akala song. You know, it's the inequality that drives you insane. I am, from a macro point of view, I mean, one of the undiscussables within organizational settings is gross inequality in pay levels. I remember when I started off my working life, I remember reading Drucker, who thought a ratio between most senior and most junior people was about 20 to 1. And Drucker was not seen as a raving socialist. He was viewed as just a sensible capitalist. And we're now dealing with hundreds, thousands to 1 ratios. And I think that is possibly the really uncomfortable discussion that needs to begin to take place. I'm just thinking of the word hippo, which is when people are in groups, everybody's waiting for the highest person, the opinion of the highest paid person in the room. But again, this whole idea that we are, if we are challenging so many things about that the status quo is fair, that somehow and the trouble is, if you challenge the status quo of the inequality of pay, is this the language of the envy, the politics of envy kicking in? We're tiptoeing around some really hairy stuff.
Thank you very much, John. That's fascinating. And I'm also noticing that Liz and Zoe have their hands up. So Mo, if you have any further points on that, do put them in the chat. But shall we go to Liz, who was earliest into the game?
Thanks, Michael. Firstly, Megan and John, really appreciative of you bringing this, putting this on the agenda. I'm delighted. I think we need more of this, to be honest. And I'm not quite sure if it's a question, but you might be able to help me with this. I suppose there's 2 things for me. And I think it was Chris picked it up about what kind of drew you into this. And I suppose for me, I'm grappling with this in relation to being a consultant, an OD practitioner, and also seeing myself as an activist as well. Is kind of how to hold that, sometimes in tension, and the feeling that a lot of OD work needs to get beyond organisational boundaries and start to engage with the wider system. And so what does it mean to be a consultant and a citizen, and holding some of those tensions. And I suppose the other thing for me is a lot of the organisations I work with are human rights organisations, international NGOs, who are engaged in all of this. But actually, when you look at how they work, there's a huge shadow side. They are activists. They do a lot of advocacy internally, but not inquiry. And so they identify with being activists, but actually a lot of people are burnt out. They're not modeling what they're promoting out there. And so there's a real kind of disconnect there as well. So I suppose I'm just interested about how do we work those internal disconnects, as well as maybe with those organizations that are promoting activism, but actually they need to also look at themselves as well. I'm not quite sure that's a question, but it's just something I carry, I suppose. So I suppose just the last thing is there's a lot to be learned from the social movement. So how do we get beyond employee activism to thinking about our theory of change in relation to social movements, and how does that inform the way we think about change internally too? So the cluster of issues there, but interested in your response to those.
Lovely, thanks Liz, really interesting points. On the social movement, of course, we John and I have focused particularly on employee activism, but at the same time, there's a constellation of influences happening in terms of shareholder activism and consumer activism coming together, that's sort of shifting and potentially, creating social movements. That's a really interesting area. I particularly loved what you said about activist organizations and activists. So one thing that was very obvious in our research was, both John and I were staggered at the amount of burnout for activists. So and of course, let me just recognize that we're all talking about different things when we use the label activists. So we're talking as if we know what we're talking about, but people within organizations that are challenging the status quo, put it that way for the moment, that is hard work to sustain. And many of the activists we spoke to had heartbreak, just gutting stories about trying for, to change dynamics, and some quite toxic dynamics. And we've been alongside, there's one or two activists that really come to mind that were two of the most impressive people, to be fair, I've ever met. And being alongside them over the last year and seeing them fall over and seeing the utter waste, and having my head in my hands and thinking from an organizational perspective, actually, this person is not a radical troublemaker. They're actually bringing in such a valuable dimension, and they're just being flattened. So that I picked that up in what you were talking about. And of course, the issue with activist organizations is, of course, they then take on the advocacy, and with that, the rightness, if we're not careful, the rightness. Now, many of the activists we interviewed, the other quite surprising thing that John and I found early on is that one of the themes which came up in our coding of interviews of activism was one of the highest skills they talked about was listening, and the ability, actually, before the advocacy, to really genuinely find out the experience of others and to listen and learn. And what can happen when we're advocating something passionate, that we're passionate about, is it's so easy to stop that listening inquiry mode, especially when all you're getting is being kind of kicked back. So I really recognize that trap for activist individuals and organizations of shutting down the inquiry and the desire to be challenged, the desire, the knowledge that we don't know what we don't know. Yeah. John, did you want to say?
I'm aware, Michael, you had someone else who's been waiting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Megan. And so Zoe, I'll bring you in a moment, and I'll just mention that I've got Leo's chat in mind as well. So Zoe, over to you.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to share some thoughts, really. So I'm I work for a large mental health trust in London, and I've got two parts to my role, but I'm the Freedom to Speak Up guardian for the trust. And so it's through that work that I came across John and Megan, and John was fabulous in supporting us in coming up with an interesting Freedom to Speak Up strategy. But I'm now leading on a piece of work which is about, it's a national pilot to fundamentally eliminate racial disparity in mental health services, not a small task. And we're working in partnership with Black community organisations. And we said we wanted to build a group of people to work on this work, along with everything else we're doing. And being an NHS trust, we said, well, you know, we should get some champions to work in the trust. The Black community organisations we're working with said, no, we want a social movement of activists. And we're working with the community to get a social movement of activists. So the colleague I was working with says, oh God, you'll never get the word activist accepted in the mental health trust. So anyway, I emailed the top people and said, what about PCREF? That's the title, PCREF activists. And I was just surprised that all the senior directors said, yeah, we much prefer that word to champion. We want to become an anti-racist organisation. Let's go with that. So we're now in the bizarre situation, quite opposite to your conversation, of an organisation that's welcomed the word activist, presumably everybody with their own different interpretations of what it actually is going to mean. And we think that we're working with the Black community to build activism in amongst the service users and carers, the Black service users and carers, amongst the Black community and amongst the trust staff, to end up with this social movement that will flip the mental health experience, which is, I don't need to tell you, but, you know, on all dimensions, you get a shit outcome, you know, in the main, and more likely to happen if you're Black. So it was just to share that, really, that I liked John's dial thing, because it's always the issue with any change program, isn't it? Is the leaders say they're welcoming change, but are they really facading what's really going on? And the trust has had an enormous push on Black Lives Matter, and you know, nearly 50% of the staff group are from Black and other communities. And we're now, I think they're balmy, but the board has said it's not only going to become an anti-racist organisation, but the leading anti-racist mental health organisation in the country, without yet a definition of anti-racism or any of these things. So really just to share that, and any thoughts about turning the rhetoric to reality would be gratefully received.
John, do you want
Megan or John?
Wow. I was thinking of the old actors thing, when things aren't going on stage. It's if you're going to die, die big. I'm just thinking there is something just gorgeously, you know, ambitious about this, and I just love the idea of actually the champion stuff is just we've been there, we've done that, we know all the stuff. And I was thinking that actually the pushback on that, hang on, this is about a community movement, and I think that this let's not focus it on an individual, but let's create. I think that I was just, you know, I was grinning the whole way you were talking about it, thinking, you know, my research was thinking, oh, can we track you as you do this, please? Because it's just going to be fascinating, because that's the sort of stuff that gives, you know, it'd be such a gorgeous experience to share. Because, you know, again, the response of the senior management coming back is, yeah, we'll go with the activism stuff. That's a different language, and I'm a big fan of that. Words matter, and unfortunately, you know, so much of the language around this has been sort of deadened, and it's this activism stuff is about getting in your guts. You know, this is about, you know, really, this isn't the dead language of corporate values. This is about, you know, personal integrity. This is about the real zest of life. And I just, as you're describing that, I'm thinking, this is about working with the zeitgeist. This isn't about, packaging it up and making it look good. This is going to be, yours is going to be a fantastically messy project. I mean, the chances of controlling it and, having a Gantt chart where you can say, we've achieved, community buy-in at this point. But something's going to happen, or at least it's got a good chance of happening.
I'll just add one point, because I know and then we'll move on. But Zoe, what you brought to mind was actually in the NHS, had a conversation with a big group on activism. And somebody in that group, profoundly said during the research, it's absolutely fine for some people to wear the label activist. In fact, it's kind of quite cool. And in a way, I'm a bit like that. I'm like, I can write about activists. Yeah, I'm an activist. And she, very much said, there's plenty of people in the NHS that they can never wear that label because of the consequences it would have. And that really stuck with me when we're talking about the words. Similarly, you look in the world, it might be okay, it might be quite cool and trendy to call yourself an activist, maybe in the UK, maybe in the US, dodgy, not in Hong Kong or, at the moment. It's an entirely different level of consequences, and I was fascinated by that in terms of those labels and what they convey and who can wear them and who can't wear them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Zoe, and for your answers there. So, Leora, I don't know if you can speak. Are you able to? Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I can.
And then Philippa.
First of all, thank you so much. That's been super inspiring. I'm really interested in this aspect of intersectionality, because it seems like there are so many different groups that are all at each other's throats. It's the trans and non-binary people get it from the feminists, and then it's about, well, what about the rural working class white boys in deprived coastal areas? And, it just kind of keeps getting bigger and bigger. And there seems to be a lot of zero-sum thinking going on, that there's only, one, and whoever gets it first gets it and the other ones don't. Whereas the people who systemically could actually do something about it just kind of lean back in their padded chairs and watch the fight. And I'm really wondering what we can do to kind of make that work better, because at the moment, I think we're losing a lot of precious energy in some of that.
Yeah, really relate to that, Leo. The thing that comes to mind, again, a very strong theme that came out from our interviews with activists was the importance of connecting and relating with other activists of other, from other areas, and not slipping into this pattern of like, okay, well, the problem is, the reality is that organizations do have a kind of like, right, we can support 3 themes this year, right, fight. who's gonna get there? And so when the organizations as well is sort of setting out that, there's limited resources, we can only take a stand on a few issues, it does tend to, if you're not careful and if you're not aware in the moment of this occurring, it can start to pitch people against one another. And some of what we do is to help press the pause button, and just bring people out so that you can observe the dynamic that's occurring and the consequences and implications that it's having on them and also the organization. Part of what we find is that people are so caught into these habits, and they're so, they don't have the space and the time to be able to observe and stand back and say, hang on, this isn't helping anybody. If there was a way of doing this more productively and engaging, what would it be? But when we have organizational systems and workplaces that don't allow ourselves the time and space to pause and be able to have that kind of meta awareness, it makes it very difficult to start to shift the habits that start to perpetuate it. So no silver bullet answer at all to that, Leo. But I would say, do we have the time and space to notice what we're up to? And yes, this importance of connecting with and learning from, and being very careful with that theory that we've only got space for a few things is absolutely vital.
Can I just build on that? I'm just so aware that when we do our cooperative inquiry groups, so we get together with groups for a couple of hours at a time, and the aim is sort of after, so one, there's the theme, so we have the conversation, and then we pause it to actually get people to pay attention to the conversational dynamic. And it is that actually paying attention to the conversational dynamic matters, and it's not just an affectation. And it's actually extraordinarily important to bring to people's attention, did you notice that that person got silenced? Did you notice when you silenced yourself? And actually to bring explicitly those sort of group dynamics. And again, that's a discipline that, you know, as researchers, we take very seriously, but in our workplaces, much less so.
Thank you very much, John. Great.
Thank you.
Philippa, you.
Yeah, I thought we might be running out of time, but it was just a really quick question to add on to what Zoe was saying about changing champions to agents, to activists. I was just wondering, John and Megan, whether you've come across any other phrases that in your research that companies are using, or people in companies are using, perhaps as the word activist is so loaded. Did you hear any stories of other, perhaps more user-friendly, less loaded words, but were actually meaning the same thing?
Not really. The ones that come to mind are the ones that probably get, you know, many people, myself included, slightly rolling their eyes, which is kind of, you know, the change agents, the change leaders, the change makers, the advocates. Advocates has been an interesting one actually recently that I've come across. Activists, allies, champions. There's a kind of broad list of what I guess the, you know, there is no perfect word for it, but the debate and discussion around what does this label mean to us and what does it convey is probably the, you know, and to have the discussions about, well, what do we want it to convey is a really important point around it. But words matter. Yeah.
Just to interrupt, I know I should put my hand up. What we've ended up calling ourselves activists and allies, because the feedback was that some white people might feel, have I got space here? Can I, you know, in this campaign, I want to get on board with it. And so activists and allies is the phrase.
Thank you. And as Cassie's hand went up, and then I'll come to Chris.
Thank you. So a bit of an introduction, because it's probably quite useful. I work in private equity normally on the operating partner side, and this is incredibly difficult. I try to be a bit of a mole in the camp, but can be very tricky. But at the moment, I'm on a sabbatical working on an industry framework for moving forward. DE&I. And I was interested in the zero tolerance, creating spirals of silence piece, because it's sort of, when you're looking at organizations where certain behaviors, certain ways of being are totally opposite to the activist agenda, and create cultures that are toxic even before you can, you know, approach this kind of thing. You tend to use zero tolerance as a shorthand for when you have toxic leadership behaviors, particularly saying if they can't change, then you need to raise it and potentially you need to oust them. So and perhaps that's too, you know, I appreciate you need to do the work on empathy, and you need to do the work on trying to shift those perspectives. But with your work and that piece, particularly around mistakes and bringing in things like positive intent, how does zero tolerance still have a place, or not? And if not, what replaces it?
John.
Lovely. John, and you've got 20 seconds, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay. What I as you were talking about that, what was coming up was it's the calling out, and I was just being aware that for instance, I can call out, because I have the appearance, I've got the accent, I've got the voice. I can often call out people of my age, generation, and background. I can sort of just go, that didn't sound quite right. And it's this whole question of, rather, the zero tolerance policy just means, oh, it's the political correctness grades, or, you know, it's the woke brigade. That's what's playing out in the head. But it is this thing of, who is the person who is best positioned to call out? So it's about, if you've got a, you know, it's unlikely on an executive team that everyone's going to be toxic. So if there's one individual who you know is going to be, you know, has the voice and willing to tell it, they're the ally to speak at that point, who have the power and the status to challenge. So it's I suppose the question in my mind is, actually public calling out is a thing. And it's also this thing of, when do you do it in public, when do you do it in private? Because often, again, we're into the people not being aware of their behaviors. And I'm also aware of, I'm thinking of, I'm just so conscious of time, is of one senior executive who had a conversation with me because we've been at school together. He said, I can't get my head around the Black Lives Matter thing, and I can't talk about it in my organization because I don't know the language to talk about it, and I'll be clumsy. And so it's often, you know, there will be the odd evil bastard out there, but let's work with the assumption that they're a relative minority. And it is often the people who are terrified of being clumsy, or just don't even know how to begin to unpick this, and who's the people they can listen to. I often think zero tolerance is a clumsy catch-all when we're actually when you need to have a more sophisticated social intervention.
Thank you very much, John. Chris, do you have your hand up, and do you want to conclude?
Well, I want to say something by way of conclusion, and then Michael, leave the very end to you. I just want to say thank you to John and Megan. I mean, for donkey's years, my passion has been what I call, you know, as far as possible, bringing radical humanism into organizations. My inspirations are, you know, people like Manabendra Roy and liberation theology and Paulo Freire, and more recently, John Alexander and the citizenship movement. And I see what you're doing in Speak Up and employee activism as, you know, massively important in that tradition. So enormous gratitude to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Megan, and thank you, John. We are, I'm afraid, now out of time, but really,
yeah,
thank you.
Much appreciation and fabulous work. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.